you so much to everyone for joining us here today. And welcome to the people who are joining us now. Kundan is connecting from Toronto now, as I mentioned. Unfortunately, he cannot make it at the faculty, but we are very happy that he agreed to connect online and we can still continue doing the series of dialogues. And also I'm welcoming the people who are connecting from different parts of the world. We send the link to many people, so they are joining us from their homes and places. So we are this is the third session of the dialogues that are dedicated on Indigenous peoples issues. And today, as you might know, we are gonna talk about the situation of Indigenous peoples in Asia, and where we have Kundan Kumar with us. I'm gonna invite people connecting online to introduce themselves in the chats and tell us where they are connecting from. That would be very nice to hear from them, and also if they have any insights or any comments, they are free to post them in the chat. So we are knowing how to do these hybrid events, and I hope you have a great moment and we can learn on from Kundan's and the discussions. Luisa, Castaneda, and I'm the coordinator of the dialogues. And to start, I would like to welcome Reina Young, who is a member of the ILADA. She's gonna give, ILADA is a partner of the dialogue with the center. So Reina is gonna give some welcome remarks. Reina. She's also not in a good health, so she's connecting from home. Reina, the floor is yours.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Okay. Thank you everyone for being here. Also to Luisa for leading the coordination of the event, and to the Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism for their support. My name's Reina, and I'm a member of the Indigenous Law Association, also known as ILADA, at the McGill Faculty of Law. ILADA is a co-organizer of dialogues. I am a settler who grew up on Mi'kmaq territory, and this is my second year of being involved with ILADA and with the organization of the dialogues. We've had some very productive discussions, and I look forward to hearing what comes out of this third session. For those unfamiliar with the event series, the Dialogues on Indigenous Peoples Stories, Stories of Resilience, is an initiative to start conversations on Indigenous peoples, their realities, endeavors, and positive contributions on issues of global concern. The objective is to involve students, scholars, the faculty, civil society, and the larger public in meaningful discussions to foster theoretical and practical engagement to advance Indigenous peoples' rights. For this third session, our guest will delve into the challenges and complexities faced by Indigenous peoples in Asia, including discussions about indigeneity in Asia, the lack of recognition of Indigenous peoples, collective rights, and the impacts of climate change. Before I introduce our guest speaker, a few words to acknowledge the land that we are on. Usually the land acknowledgement serves to remind everyone that McGill University, and more broadly Montreal, is located on unceded Indigenous lands. The Anishinaabe and Ganyangahaga nations have long been recognized as the custodians of these lands and waters. However, given the current hybrid context, those in attendance today may be dispersed all over Turtle Island. Wherever you are probably situated on unceded Indigenous lands upon which the Crown has unilaterally imposed its jurisdiction. So wherever you are joining from, let us acknowledge and respect the Indigenous people's continued connections with the territory that is now known as Canada. ILADA honors, recognizes, and respects these sovereign nations as the traditional stewards of the lands and waters on which we stand. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Kundan Kumar, who is a researcher and advocate for rights-based approaches to climate change and conservation. He has experience as a researcher and teacher at the University of Toronto in international NGOs such as Rights and Resources Initiative, and as a social movement activist for Indigenous and community rights in India. He has supported Indigenous peoples and local communities across the Asia region in their efforts for recognition of collective resource rights over their lands and territories. His current interests are in Indigenous peoples' collective rights over territories and natural resources and their intersections with conservation, climate change, and ecological restoration. I will now pass things over to Luisa and Dr. Kumar.
Thank you so much, Raina. Thank you for acknowledging the territory, and also thank you for recognizing the importance of these dialogues to advancing the realization of Indigenous people rights. So Kundan, we are gonna start this dialogue, and I wanted to thank you very much for being here and connecting online and sharing all your knowledge and experience with us. We are very, very honored to have you. And I would like to start the dialogue with one question, and it's about, when we talk about Asia, we know that Asia is such a big region, therefore it's very diverse. And when we talk about Asian indigenous people, there is always some contestations around. So I would like to ask you to start this dialogue is how, like, who are indigenous peoples in Asia? Kundan, maybe we can start with a background on this to move forward in the conversation.
Thank you, Luisa. Before I start, I would like to also humbly acknowledge that I'm an immigrant on the land, which is the traditional territories of many nations, including the Mississauga of the Credits, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people. I'm truly humbled and grateful to these nations for being on their land and enjoying their traditional territories. I'm also thankful to the McGill Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism for inviting me to this dialogue. And I think the question that Luisa asked, who are the indigenous people in Asia? It's a complex question. There's a lot of answer. It will take a long time to answer, really capture even the smallest bit of this complexity. Very briefly, indigenous people in Asia, they're almost around. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
I have an echo at me. Okay. They're estimated around 260 million to 410 million, depending on the definition that you take of indigenous people in Asia. And there are literally thousands of indigenous peoples across the continent. They speak more than 1,000 languages, indigenous languages. This is such a bounty of knowledge, of culture, of tradition, and it's such richness in the continent. Unfortunately, not much appreciated by the leadership of the various nations who don't seem to understand the gift that has been given to them in form of the indigenous people. The countries with the largest number of indigenous people are India, China, Indonesia, Philippines. India has around 100 million indigenous people. These are very large numbers. And China also has 100 million people, indigenous people. Indonesia has around 70, and Philippines 20. And other smaller countries also, they're quite substantive number of indigenous people. And these indigenous peoples range from hunter-gatherers to pastoralists, people who live in high mountains, people who live in rangelands, shifting cultivators, subsistence cultivators, and even marine and riverine fisheries communities, artisan groups. So there's a huge diversity of indigenous people and the knowledges. If you start looking at the territories and the areas that they inhabit, the estimate is that at least 7 million square kilometers of Asia are indigenous people's territories. That works out to 17% of Asia's land. This is likely an underestimate, but they live in the high mountains, they live in the deserts, they are in the tropical forests. all kind of biomes and areas. These are some of the most fragile, ecologically diverse, important areas, the watersheds, the forests, and they have been living in these areas and governing these lands as per the customary systems. And I think when you think about the territories of indigenous people and the governance systems, these are extremely diverse. It's obviously because of the diversity of indigenous people themselves and the landscapes they live in. But there are two or three things that really kind of stand out. I think one thing that stands out is that the land governance systems, the territorial governance systems, these are not separate from the cosmology and spiritual world of the indigenous people. It's part of their day-to-day lives, day-to-day existence in terms of their spirituality, their cosmology, their cosmonies, their lived practices as such. And another important point is that most of the land that indigenous people in Asia are, these are governed as commons, as collective responsibility. And this is collective responsibility not only to the community but also to the land itself, and vice versa. And a third point that I would like to make about indigenous people in Asia, and which is common with what you have in other parts of the world with indigenous people, is that these are not, when we say that it's a customary system or a traditional system, it almost seems as if it's fixed to something in the past. These are not fixed systems. These are adaptive learning systems and based in the ecological knowledges. And these, the traditional knowledge of indigenous people's knowledges are also adaptive learning systems. So these kind of evolve and change. And I think that to part that kind of explains the resilience of this indigenous people themselves who have faced so much of shocks and over the period of years. I think looking at this is kind of an introduction, very brief introduction to indigenous people in Asia. Luisa.
Thank you, Kundan. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. You talk about that in Asia is the region with the largest population of indigenous peoples, but we acknowledge that it's also the region that has more issues recognizing the existence of indigenous people within the territories. Indigenous peoples in most countries in Asia, as you know, they are not legally recognized. And also Nepal is the only country that has ratified the ILO Convention of 169. So perhaps you can tell us about how do states treat indigenous people? What is the status of recognition of indigenous peoples in the region? You started talking about India, China, Indonesia, but perhaps you can give us a broader idea of the status of recognition.
Thanks, Lisa. When we think about Asia, the perception is that it's very different from the settler colonist nations and the status of indigenous people. However, there are many similarities on the way indigenous people have been treated in Asia region and in different countries in Asia. And if you start looking at the history of different regions and countries and look at the historical formation of modern state, that intersection with indigenous peoples and their territories and their governance systems have been somewhat similar to what has been faced by indigenous people in the settler colonist countries. There has not been an external colonization, but there has been an internal process of colonization. And the impact of that has been really extremely difficult for indigenous people. Their systems have been affected, their societies and systems have been affected quite deeply. And the process of, you can look at how these processes impacted and what were the processes that impacted indigenous people. And these are complex histories for each nation, sometimes even in different parts of each country. The way emergence of modern states, both colonial and post-colonial states, have affected the territories of and indigenous people societies themselves. There have been, I think, 2 or 3 things that really stand out again, which are common across Asia. One is that even though these were not terra nullius as in the settler colonies, these nations are not, but the governments and both the colonial and post-colonial states did apply principles which almost treated these landscapes as territories as terra nullius, and they appropriated across the continent. You'll see that indigenous lands and territories have been appropriated by the state and declared as state territories, and the processes have been diverse. They're often based in quasi legal systems. Sometimes there have been very cunning subterfuges which have been used. And again, the situation varies from place to place in terms of how the territories and lands of indigenous people have been taken away by the state. And once these have become state land, then these are easily given away to corporate sector, to concessionaires. And if you look at Indonesia, for example, or India or other countries like Laos or Cambodia, we basically see this happening even now, unfolding even now, that land which is indigenous territory has been handed over to private concessionaires and companies. One more thing that has happened is that as the nation states imposed their systems of land and land governance, which is largely based on the principles of household land ownership or privatization, they really affected the customary systems of indigenous people. So if indigenous people territories, even if land rights were recognized, it was recognized only for individual land. So what you have is that the customary systems that indigenous people had started to get broken down and affected by this process of privatization, imposition of private property rights. That also helped the non-indigenous people to move into indigenous territories and start taking over land. So overall, in most parts of Asia, if you look at indigenous peoples and their societies and cultures, they have been really affected by the deterritorialization of their own territories. That has also had an impact on the indigenous people societies and culture. Normally the kind of processes governments have pushed for assimilation. We have a similar system of residential schools, for example, in India, as it still exists as in Canada. And there is a process of assimilation, use of language, use of cultural processes through which indigenous people's cultures are being lost. So that's really, there has been a process. Indigenous people have undergone a process of colonization, internal colonization in most of the countries in Asia. There have been some places where some amount of flexibility or some amount of acknowledgement was made to their lands, often because of political reasons or relations linked to power. And we can see that in, for example, Northeast India, where a certain sort of recognition has taken place. So that's the historical background. And as we come to the present, and especially with the last 2 decades, the indigenous movement in the world, and with the ILO 169 and UN RIP and other international conventions, what we see is a slight amount of shift and a greater acknowledgement of indigenous people, or at least the importance of such communities. But most of the governments in Asia still don't recognize indigenous people as per international norms. They kind of, except 4 or 5 countries, the indigenous people are not recognized as peoples. So the large countries such as China, India, and Indonesia, they do provide certain protections to indigenous people through other terms. So they use terms like ethnic minorities, or in India, they use terms like scheduled tribe. And in Indonesia, they use the term Masyarakat Adat to designate what we would see internationally as indigenous people. And the protection is, of course, not sufficient. And there's always a huge amount of confliction issues happening because of all this. Luisa.
Thank you, Kundan. There are some papers and researchers doing research on the contestation of using the term indigenous peoples as such. You know, we know that this is a great international term, but I mean, beyond that the states do not recognize indigenous peoples. How is the context with an indigenous peoples organization? You know, they do recognize as indigenous peoples using this term, or how have you seen that situation in your experience?
It's a difficult situation for indigenous people in Asia. As I said, that there are around 4 to 5 nations which do recognize indigenous people in different form within their, either in the constitution or in the law. For example, Nepal, for example, Malaysia, and countries like the big countries as such, they do not recognize indigenous people. There's a lot of politics behind this. And part of it is that countries like India or Indonesia say that everybody who is in those countries is indigenous. So when they're talking about the international norms, they're basically saying that, okay, everybody is indigenous because we have all been living here forever. And so the other aspects of indigenous people, the definitions that we have, them being minority, their relationship with land and territories, those are being ignored by these governments. And so these arguments have been going on for quite some time. And the indigenous peoples themselves in most of these countries self-identify themselves as indigenous people. There are strong indigenous movements in almost most of the countries where movements are allowed to survive. In China, obviously, it's difficult to indigenous people to stand up and say that we're indigenous people. The Tibetan diaspora does say that they're indigenous people, but that's in the autocratic countries very difficult. But at least in the countries where there's some space for speaking out, where movements exist, indigenous people have mobilized and self-identify themselves indigenous people. They participate in the international fora, and I can see people from Nepal here. Nefin, for example, represents in international people in Nepalese indigenous people in international fora. Aman so there is quite a bit of organizing going on, and this is a lot of it. This is kind of emergent from below, and obviously this depends in this really happens in spaces in countries where there is some kind of political space for mobilization and social movements. And so there are countries now where this is not allowed. For example, Laos, if you talk about indigenous people, you can get into trouble. And so it's difficult for them to kind of really present themselves, especially if you're living within Laos, to go and talk about being indigenous. So the situation is difficult and complex. But I think what is really important to note is that wherever in all these countries in Asia, and there have been mobilizations, there have been efforts to struggle, and indigenous people have a very long history of struggling against oppression and of resistance. And if you look at, say, for example, the history of India, some of the most powerful struggles against British colonial rule was by the indigenous people, and which forced the British government to give them certain concessions in terms of recognizing them as a special category.
When you talk that there is this lack of recognition and of the legal recognition of indigenous people, and you mentioned a bit about the situation of the land rights, you know, so if they are not legally recognized indigenous people, therefore they don't have the rights based on the international right, the UNDRIP ILO 169. So maybe we can talk more about it. How is the connection of the lack of this legal recognition related to the lack of territorial rights, but also how the lack of these territorial rights is leading to the criminalization of indigenous peoples. 2 weeks ago, like 1 week ago, Global Witness presented the latest report on criminalization of killings of indigenous environmentalists of indigenous peoples that were killed last year. No, in Latin America, Asia, and Africa are the regions with more victims, which is connected to the lack of recognition of the rights of these people. No, and In Asia, India and the Philippines are the countries with more victims, and the Philippines, we know about this law anti-terrorism. No, and is connected to what you just said about that the people, indigenous people, might not have the agency to go to advocate, protest for the right. So maybe you can give us like an idea, some insight of how all this is related, and how the situation of killings and attacks and criminalization of indigenous peoples in the region.
Thanks, Luisa. In a very broad brush, the situation in each country is really complicated and complex. It depends on the legal systems, it depends on the constitution, the politics. But on a broad brush basis, you can look at different countries, and most countries don't recognize indigenous people themselves. So that precludes their recognition of their land rights and territorial rights as per international norms, what has been in the international, in ILO and in the UN RIP. However, in some countries, there is some protection provided, even when they don't recognize indigenous people. There's some kind of protection provided in the constitutions or through legal means. And for example, in India, scheduled tribes have certain amount of protections provided under the law, including for the land and territories. And in some countries, there are ways in which their land and territories have been respected to some extent. And again, these are historically generated and vary from country to country. For example, Nepal does recognize indigenous people, but it does not recognize the rights to their territories. So there's huge areas of Nepal which would be treated, which indigenous people see as their territories, as their lands, and which are not recognized by government, but are converted into forest lands or conservation areas or rangelands owned by the state. And in other countries, like a few other countries like India, there is some amount of recognition in the northeast part of India through the autonomous councils and other Schedule 6, and which allow indigenous people some amount of autonomy and some amount of territorial control. The rest of the mainland India, the almost 70 million people don't have that. So most countries, if you look at it, there are no real pathways for indigenous people to get and obtain their indigenous rights and the territorial rights over land. And there are now, after the last couple of decades, as indigenous people are mobilized strongly, there have been some reforms, potential reforms, which have opened some kind of a hope, created some kind of hope. So, for example, in Indonesia, the constitution recognizes Masyarakat Adat, which is the customary community, and based on that, the Constitutional Court of in Indonesia kind of gave a judgment that Adat lands are not state lands, especially Adat forests or customary forests are not state forests, and they should be handed over back to the Adat communities, which are the indigenous people that we're talking about. And that process, a legal basis has been created, but in practice, very little land has actually been given back to indigenous people, barely 70,000 hectares out of around 16 to 17 million hectares, which have already been mapped by indigenous people of Indonesia as their Adat lands, customary Adat lands. Barely 70,000 hectares has been basically given back to indigenous people. So in India, for example, the long struggle over years led to the enactment of Forest Rights Act, which provides rights to the scheduled tribes over forest lands. And that the process of implementation of this law has been really slow, and barely 5 million out of 40 million hectares has gone back to indigenous people. So there are potential kind of places where rights can be recognized, pathways of, but that's not really happening to the extent it should happen. And at the same time, what has happened is that all the customary land is now indigenous customary land, their territories, because it's state land under, say, categories of forests or conservation areas, or has been handed over to private companies. The indigenous people's day-to-day life itself has been criminalized. So anything that they do, so it's basically treated as infringement of some other law. And I'll give an example from India, is that India has one of the largest population of shifting cultivators, especially in the eastern states of Orissa. And the forest laws, all the shifting cultivation land has been converted into forest land as legal forests. So these are forest laws apply on this, and forest laws don't allow anybody to set fire or to cut down a tree. Now, shifting cultivation is the whole process is an agroforestry, temporal agroforestry system, where you cut down trees, and you light fire to do shifting cultivation. It's a sustainable system. It does not require external inputs. The inputs come from, but anybody who does shifting cultivation now is a criminal in the eyes of law. And there are millions of shifting cultivators who have basically been criminalized, so been forced off the land. And similar situation exists in terms of conservation areas, where even for example, in India or in Nepal, even if you go inside a conservation area, protected area, and break a leaf, that's a criminal activity. Now, the whole basic livelihood of indigenous people who live in these areas has been forest product collection, has been hunting, and everything is extremely criminalized, and that is what is leading to killings that you hear from Nepal, the killing of indigenous people in conservation areas, or the displacement of conservation people from conservation in India, Indonesia, etc. So all these processes which require land, and where land has not been recognized, indigenous land has not been recognized, it has been converted to other uses, and that has led to a lot of conflict and repression and criminalization of indigenous people. And at any time, if you look at all of these countries, if you look at the prison statistics, you'll find that there are a large number of indigenous people either under trial or who have been arrested for breaking laws, which they would see as basically practicing their customary activities. So there is criminalization, there is killing of. And another thing which has happened is that as indigenous people organize to fight against this injustice, there is the repression kind of comes back. And there's a whole political economy of exploitation of forest, of land, of involvement of powerful actors, including the corporate sector, which you can, for example, you can look at Indonesia and look at the whole political economy of palm oil plantations and the involvement of the country's elite in that process. And the fact that, that people who oppose this are bound to be are criminalized or arrested or sometimes even killed. So yes, I think it's a similar situation as in Latin America, and some countries are really bad. Philippines is probably, even in spite of the fact that they have laws which recognize rights of indigenous people, hasn't particularly bad because of its political economy. Thanks, Luisa.
Yeah, for instance, the former special rapporteur on the rights of indigenous people, she is from the Philippines, the digital report. She was in the list of the terrorists, no? Because she was defending the rights of indigenous peoples all over the world. But Kundan, I would like to jump into another ongoing discussion that I can hear in the global debates when we talk about indigenous peoples, is this association of indigenous people with local communities. We can see, for instance, in Latin America, there is no issue about it, because indigenous people in most countries are recognized. Afro-descendant peoples are recognized as such. But when we can talk about Africa or Asia, as Kundan said, for instance, in many countries there are no recognized. Sometimes there are indigenous people are put in this box of local communities. When the Rio conventions started, the biodiversity conventions, indigenous people somehow were treated to like the same level as local communities. And for indigenous people, where they declared that this is no right because indigenous people have a dedicated legal international framework. Local communities do not have that. And that's why they put it in this position, I give the right to states to not respect the rights. So I'd like to hear from you, Kundan, how is it this discussion, and perhaps could have a positive or negative impact, but now that we are like talking about the post-20 framework biodiversity that are approved in December, so maybe that's very important to discuss.
This is a dilemma for us because indigenous people obviously have a special status as per international law and special protections. So, and that is one reason that communities across the world are trying to self-identify as indigenous, and then the question is that the states themselves don't recognize these people as indigenous, so they do not apply those protections on the indigenous people who are living within the boundaries, but who are not formally recognized as indigenous people. However, there are also people who would even by the international definition not count as indigenous people, peasantry, other communities, part of the mainstream or the dominant communities, and who are disempowered and who are kind of living in who also kind of are looking at land and looking at natural resources. So there is whole trend of community-based management, community-based forestry that's going on. Now, what has happened in Asia, if you look at different countries, that there have been conflicts between people who identify themselves as indigenous people, and often between people who are basically from peasantry or other communities, especially those who have moved into indigenous areas. And that has created a lot of conflict and tension. You can see that in Indonesia, you can see that in India, you can see that in Nepal. In every country that you find this happening, that people have moved into indigenous people's area, and that conflict does reflect in the politics at the national level, and creates this whole kind of thing about dichotomy between indigenous people who are self-identifying indigenous people and people who don't identify as indigenous people. However, at the state level and national level, when you look at it from the legal perspective, indigenous people are not recognized, so they're basically lumped with the local communities, and that creates a confusion at different scales, especially at the international scale. What we have been kind of my own thinking about this, and what I've been trying in my practice, is that one is that where indigenous people have self-recognized themselves, so that we have to accept that as international community, as outsiders, respect their decision to do that, and accept that they're special, they have special rights and special as per international laws, and that look, they're different from local communities. So you can't bracket indigenous people with local communities, especially when they are identified or recognized as indigenous people. The second thing that is important is that even though there are ground level tensions and conflicts, normally what happens is that they are both in local communities and indigenous people are often in conflict or often in standoff against the states and other powerful actors. And therefore, one of the things that is really important is that resolving some of these conflicts and then standing together against the elites of the country, of the state, for example. And you can see that this is something that is happening. There has been a lot of conflict between indigenous people and other communities, but also that there's a lot of cooperation now between the apex organizations or formations of indigenous people and non-indigenous people to, say, for example, in Indonesia, to push for land reforms, which includes a reform of recognition of indigenous territories. So Aman and the peasantry organizations, the apex peasantry organization, Aman is the apex organization of indigenous people, and they are cooperating together, both in terms of politics and kind of fighting against the government. I think another example that we see of positive collaboration was in India, where when Forest Rights Act was being enacted, it was supposed to be only, this government wanted to impose it only for the indigenous people, for the scheduled tribes. However, the scheduled tribes representatives themselves and the local, they basically also included another category, which is called forest dweller, which included non-indigenous or non-scheduled tribe people who depended on forests. And with certain safeguards, they were included in the law and were allowed to have rights over forest land. So you have that kind of cooperation and conflict. And I think at the global level, that is the way we need to look at it, is that we, given the situation, will have to incorporate in local communities and their formations into the processes that global processes are going on, but while keeping in mind the special status of indigenous people. That should not be diluted.
Thank you, Kundan. I ask you that question because that will allow us to follow the next topic that I'm going to dedicate some time with you to talk is about climate change. And I brought this thing of the situation of association people with local communities because we are heading to the COP27 next month, and in December we are heading to the COP15 on biodiversity that's gonna take place here in Montreal. And Indigenous people are like, there is a global caucus going on currently today. They are in charge, you know, discussing how they're gonna organize for the COP27. And I want to talk about climate change and then about finance, the direct finance that Indigenous people should receive for their contribution to mitigate climate change. But before we go there, I would like to talk to you about how Indigenous peoples contribute to mitigate climate change, but also how Indigenous peoples are being affected by climate change. There are the Indigenous people are the least who contribute to climate change, but are the most impacted by that. And perhaps we can see that it's being created a narrative on how the Indigenous people protect 80% of the biodiversity, you know? And we have this huge narrative that everyone is saying now. No? That's important for Indigenous peoples too, because it has allowed them to have a position, no? A seat on the table when making these decisions. And that's what I like to see, like from the Asian perspective in this region, how you can see that climate change is impacting Indigenous people and how they are contributing to mitigate.
This is something which is the whole issue of climate change and the way the climate change processes are happening, especially in Asia. The mitigation adaptation process is really frustrating from the perspective of Indigenous people. So first of all, it's pretty well known that Indigenous people are really affected by climate change, and especially because they live in more fragile landscapes, which are more vulnerable to climate change. They also don't have the wealth or the resources often to kind of deal with shocks. So they are vulnerable, highly vulnerable, at high risk, whereas their contribution is almost nil. Actually, most of the Indigenous people in Asia would be climate positive or carbon positive rather than carbon negative. So it's a climate justice, fundamentally a climate justice issue, that their impact of climate change would be on them. And you can see that really happening in the uplands of, say, for example, the Himalayas, the mountain ranges, the melting of glaciers, the destabilization of agriculture and herding practices. And it's a tragedy, and it's truly unjust. Having said that, more than the climate change impact, what I'm more worried about is the impact of the climate mitigation and adaptation efforts by the nation states and powerful actors in these countries. Much of the land that is required for climate change mitigation, because climate change mitigation, many of the activities are highly land intensive. So these are, for example, hydroelectric power that requires a huge amount of area. The solar or wind power, they also require a huge amount of areas. And much of the areas that are affected by climate mitigation projects are actually on Indigenous lands. And given that rights are not recognized in the lands, there's no acknowledgement of their legal status on those lands. These lands are simply taken away and they lose the land. So renewable energy projects actually have joined conservation, joined mining, joined extractive projects as the major threat to the land access of land and territorial control of Indigenous people. And this is particularly strong in Asia because it's a highly densely populated continent, and land is scarce, and therefore all of this pressure is coming, climate mitigation pressure is coming on lands which are actually held by Indigenous people. And then there is the question of nature-based solution, the mitigation through nature-based solution. That's even more problematic because we're literally talking about tree planting, afforestation, conservation over tens of millions and millions, hundreds of millions of hectares. Now, all these lands actually, most of these lands are Indigenous territories, which are not recognized which are state lands. So they're just being converted into carbon sinks. They're converted into protected areas without any regard to the people who have customarily managed and owned these lands. So this is a major risk, and I don't think that this risk is appreciated enough by people who are pushing climate-based solutions and conservation solutions in the world. And we've done quite a bit of studies and on this. We did a study, in fact, with the people in McGill University that looked at the carbon rights of indigenous people and local communities in countries where programs like REDD+ or carbon trading are taking place. And we found that barely 3 countries had rights of communities over carbon. And there are no carbon rights. And in fact, that as carbon trading and carbon markets are becoming important, the countries tend to be recentralizing the carbon rights to themselves. These are real serious issues which are not being paid attention in terms of climate change. And it's very frustrating because, if you really look at the role of indigenous people, that most of the biodiversity is on their lands. Most of the carbon sink in forests or indigenous people are in lands stewarded by indigenous people. And they're the best guardians. And if you look at Asian countries, none of the countries will find that they've been given any agency, any role in climate mitigation. They've been seen as irritants, as problems which need to be removed from the land, and basically land handed over to either private sector or government for climate mitigation, for conservation. And we have had problem with conservation for long. Means forest conservation in Asia is basically forest conservation which is practiced, and it has caused so much of trouble for indigenous people. I see people from Nepal, and they're very familiar with what has been going on in national parks. In India, what has been going on in national parks and protected area in terms of how it has affected indigenous people and their rights. So the tragedy is that you have a very good solution in terms of when you're talking about nature-based solutions. The best solutions are indigenous people and the ability to manage and steward the lands. But that's not happening on ground in Asia because the rights are not recognized in the lands. They're disrespected. Their important role is not appreciated. I think, fortunately, at the global level, this is becoming more accepted. We have generated a lot of evidence across the world. And hopefully there'll be pressure on individual countries and country level governments that they kind of put indigenous people in lead role in climate mitigation and conservation.
Kundan, thank you. I'm gonna jump on question is because I know some people in the room are interested in topics related to conservation, and also people connected online might be interested in this is, as you know, like in the next COP15 on biodiversity, member states are gonna approve the post-2020 biodiversity framework. And this is one of the important part here is about conservation efforts. Indigenous peoples are advocating that because, for so long, these protected areas, so many of these protected areas are indigenous people's territory. And before they were established, states thought that these territories were empty. They disregard that indigenous people were there for so long. And one of the claims that indigenous people are having in the context of this post-2020 biodiversity framework is that protected areas are not the only solution to prevent the destruction of biodiversity, but also indigenous people, they should be like protected areas and indigenous people's territories, because as you mentioned, it's been proved that those territories are able to help to mitigate climate change. So, and also this post-2020 global biodiversity framework aims to have like 30% of the land protected by 2030. So I would like to hear some insights of you in this regard that I believe is very timely to discuss.
Conservation. It's a bugbear for me. And so we did this study in 2020, which is called rights-based conservation, and very clearly kind of showed that the only way we can, really do conservation and prevent biodiversity collapse is by accepting the leadership and agency of indigenous people and local communities who live in high conservation value landscapes, and give them the responsibility of stewarding conservation. And what is happening on the ground in Asia is tragic, and it's really stupid in a way. What you find that in name of conservation in Asia, the areas that are under conservation, most of it is under fortress conservation, extremely highly exclusionary laws. As I said that, in India, for example, if you go into a wildlife sanctuary or national park and break a leaf, the official wildlife officials can arrest you for that. And this is and then so much of evidence that indigenous people have really protected the landscape, the biodiversity, and not only from Latin America but also from Asia. However, they're just being kept out of this process. Then in this situation, there's an inertia among the conservation organizations and the governments that they don't want to recognize the role of indigenous people in conservation. And there are opportunities in certain countries. For example, again, in India, the Forest Rights Act provides clear role to indigenous people in conservation. It basically says that it's the responsibility of indigenous people and local communities, the scheduled tribes and the forest dwellers, to protect biodiversity. And yet you don't find any efforts by the conservation organizations, the big conservation organizations, or by the government to really kind of mobilize them for conservation. They basically just pushing them out of the protected areas. In that context, if you look at 30% target, and you look at Asia, a number of countries have said, yes, we'll implement 30% target, bringing 30% of the land under conservation. It's going to be a tragedy for indigenous people with the current systems and the current political economy of conservation. And the sad part of it, that a lot of the conservation that is happening in Asia is funded by developed nations, by governments and private philanthropists from developed nations. And they have the capacity to change this. They have the capacity to bring the indigenous people and local communities in the front of and respect the agency and give them the responsibility of conservation. This would be a win-win solution. If you can get local communities, indigenous people really working on conservation, on forest landscape, on landscape restoration, ecosystem restoration, on climate mitigation, you not only provide them sources of livelihoods, you transfer wealth to them, and you also ensure that they effectively protect the landscape that they're living in. It's a pretty simple and cost-effective solution. But the institutional arrangements, the legal systems for this really does not exist. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges that both climate mitigation and conservation community has to face, because other way things would fail, because you can't have conservation effectively, especially in increasing in 30% without having the leadership of indigenous people, local community, just not possible.
Thank you, Kundan. I think we have taken more time from the discussion that you and I have. So I would like to give a space to the people who are in the room. We are like around 20 people, Kundan, in the room, and we have like around 50 people connected from different places. So it would be great to have some of them raising their hands if they have any questions, comments. And we start in the room. If some of you have some questions, maybe in the chat, we might have some questions. We're gonna open the mics for them.
Yeah, I think if people in the room are okay with it, we could start with some questions from online. We have a few, but then we can do some alternatives. So like if you people also have questions, please raise your hands. So there is actually a person in the audience that raised their hand, so I'm gonna try to invite them to speak. Matthew Ramadan, if you want. Otherwise, we're gonna go forward with some of the questions from the chat, and they basically revolve around the. Can you hear me well? First of all, Kundan Kumar?
Yeah, can you, if you can speak a bit slowly?
Sure. So the questions we have revolve mostly around the formal means of participation of Indigenous people and activism. We have one question in particular asking whether Indigenous people are participating in the electoral processes and systems of the countries they are in, and if they're managing to champion Indigenous people's rights through these processes. And also we have somebody mentioning the system in Peru that has a way of legalizing the dispossession of indigenous lands. And the questions is more about how, if at all, the system of indigenous people's titles can be utilized to repossess territories also through legal means.
It's really interesting and important question. And I think both these questions are really connected to each other. And so yes, especially in the democracies in Asia, Indigenous people have really mobilized quite well and tried to through the electoral processes and tried to, especially for recognition of rights, especially for recognition of Indigenous people themselves. And I think the examples, some good examples are from, I think, Indonesia. Before the election of the current president, there was such a mobilization, quite a huge mobilization by Indigenous people, and which forced the president to kind of, in his electoral manifesto, to basically say that they'll recognize rights of Indigenous people, the other rights as such. And actually, obviously he hasn't kept his promise fully, and the Indigenous people are quite miffed up about it. But at least the process was started, and legal systems and processes started for recognition of territorial rights of Indigenous people in Indonesia. They have been also pretty, like in Latin America, they have used electoral politics at the local level. And this is something which in Indonesia, you can see that there are districts and provinces where their electoral officers who are sympathetic to the Indigenous people have been elected. And actually quite a bit of provincial level recognition and district level recognition of Indigenous people's land has taken place, which is not yet formalized at the national level. And so there's quite a bit of political kind of work going on. And I think Aman and other allies have been really good at doing this. They know how to do this. And this is something which, we should pay attention to in Asia also. It's happening in Latin America, but it's also happening in Asia. I would give another example of Nepal, where national level, there's no kind of ways of, no legal system of recognizing the territory of Indigenous people. But Indigenous people have been working with the local level municipalities, which is the third level of government, constitutional government, where they have capacity and where they have numbers to push for recognition of rights of over territories of Indigenous people. So these are examples. And personally, in India, I was involved in this process of really making calculations of how many people can benefit, how many Indigenous people can benefit from Forest Right Act in each electoral constituency, and sharing that with the movements, Indigenous movement, to influence the candidates by saying that, okay, if you support our cause, there's so many votes in it for you, and you can. So this kind of analysis, this kind of mobilization has really helped the implementations of Forest Right Act. Also, the creation of Forest Right Act itself was through the political electoral process. It is through these processes that Indigenous people have been able to force or push governments to kind of create systems of recognition of Indigenous rights. So Indonesia, there is a system which allows for recognition of Indigenous rights over the territories, and that is being used by the Indigenous people. The process is slow. There's a lot of political opposition. Similarly, in India, there is a process of under Forest Right Act on which Indigenous people can reclaim their territories, at least in forest lands. Again, the process is happening because of the political mobilization by Indigenous people, and that's what, and the involvement in the electoral process.
Thank you, Kundan. I had Judy has a question.
Yeah, very brief.
Can you get closer, Judy? Because maybe you cannot hear you. Sorry.
Sorry. Also, both people in the room and online, if you want to introduce yourself before making the question,
Okay.
you're welcome to do so.
I'm Jude Alexander Romagna Rivas. I'm Afro-Colombian and I'm a DCL student here at McGill University, doctoral student here at McGill University, and also a fellow at the Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism. It's very brief. Antonio Guterres, who is the United Nations General Secretary, has been pushing forcefully for a global response to climate change. And we also know that there is a climate change fund at the United Nations level, which hasn't received all the contribution that it is supposed to have received to help with the transition or adaptation process. So my question is similar to what one of the persons in the audience asked. How is the engagement of indigenous community at United Nations levels, and how has been the response by the United Nations level to that advocacy? Has the United Nations level engaged with the states, given the necessity and urgency to address climate change and protect indigenous people's territory, responded accordingly to that urgency? Like, what has been kind of the response? How is that dynamic kind of working? Thank you.
Thanks. That's again a very important question, and I'll put it. There are two parts to this answer. One is that one has to acknowledge the role of United Nations and its the United Nations organizations in pushing the conception of indigenous people in especially in Asia and Africa. So they have been playing a pretty important role in because of their own acceptance of indigenous people and their incorporation of indigenous people's safeguards in their own systems. So they have been providing some support, quite a bit of support. And in fact, they're the one point of where external legitimacy to indigenous people is provided at the country level. So it's really important. Their role is really important. That said, the United Nations agencies themselves are vast, big organizations, and they are constrained by their party, the politics of the processes, and you can see that in, for example, in GEF, Global Environmental Fund or Global Climate Fund, is that even that these could be used for recognizing the rights of indigenous people and really implementing cost-effective climate mitigation or environmental protection measures. But there's very, very little money really flowing to indigenous people from the GEF or GCF. So these are, again, I think it is for us, people like us who are involved in these processes, who know about this process, to push for these changes so that kind of support to indigenous people for recognition of their territories, for recognition. And this is not just financial support, it's also political support. And you have to understand that at the country level, and this is true in Colombia. Fortunately, you have a good government, comparatively good government in Colombia now, but it's at the country level, the elites really don't want to, decentralize power and decentralize territories, land, which is most valuable to indigenous people, to give the land back. And that pressure has to come from outside as well as inside. And indigenous people are fighting for these efforts. And the UN has a major role in pushing these ideas or pushing the territorial recognition of indigenous people's rights in preventing criminalization, and they have both the moral authority and the institutional capacity and financial capacity to push for this. And we really need to push the GF, GCF, etc., to fund recognition of indigenous people rights. It's not really happening at this point of time from these funds. Thanks.
Okay, so we have a question by Gervais. If they want to activate their audio and ask the questions, also their camera if they want, they are welcome to do so.
Thank you so much to give me this opportunity. Then I'm Gervais Hokubwayo from Burundi. I think that you hear me.
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. Then I am an indigenous Mutwa from Burundi. Then I have heard that there are some countries who don't have the recognition, but as leaders of indigenous people, you have to set this matter and check how many countries that haven't recognition. When we say recognition, I think that then we tackle in a different domain such as education, agriculture, and health, and other domains. But as readers, I think that it is better to check and to help the state then to give the right to the indigenous peoples. The second thing to say is about education. I am in charge of education issues in indigenous organization from Burundi, but there is a great challenge in a different community of indigenous people, which is lack to access of education. If we lack education, I think that it will not be easy for indigenous communities then to have a development. Which reason I would inquire, or I would ask if there is any plan to support education, because as a leader of education in Burundi, I see that when the beginning of a school is at the hand, I receive different callings from the parent asking me materials, schools, school fees, and so on. But is there any plan or project to support this education sector? And also, if it will be possible, I think that you have to also to help adults then to give them then to study, because adults also there are many adults who don't know to read or write. I think that if there is any project or plan, you would help it. Thank you so much.
As an individual, I'm not. There are programs and plans of different agencies. I'm not aware of them. And linked to the recognition, I think recognition is also in terms of the country governments recognizing indigenous people as indigenous people, and to apply the protections that are provided by international law is really important. And indigenous people have to organize for that, even in African countries. And African countries, as we know, that the situation is quite difficult. Similar to Asia, that most of the countries have not recognized indigenous people, and there's a lot of controversy and issues about that. Thanks.
Okay, hello Kundan. Thank you so much for your presentation. My name is Jose. I'm a Peruvian doctoral student here at McGill. And I wanted to ask you, from my experience, indigenous rights, even if they are being recognized in these last years or last decades internationally, they are very limited or constrained out of a domination of capitalist relations and economies. And do you believe indigenous rights are actually enforceable under this reality of the economy? I believe Asia is different from Latin America, but still many of the liberalization reforms are similar. So I wanted to hear some of your thoughts on these topics.
That's again a very important and question. Which so
hello, hello.
Can you hear me?
Hello. Yes, I want to say something.
Okay.
I am from India.
Mm-hmm.
Hello.
Sorry.
Yes.
Sorry.
Hello, have you heard?
Matthew?
Hello. Hello. Have you heard?
Matthew, sorry. We invite
Hello.
you to.
We can hear you.
We invited you to ask a
Hello.
question. If you don't mind, wait a second. I'm going to mute you, and later on we're going to give you the word. Okay.
Okay.
Please.
Let me answer the question that was asked. I think, Asia, in fact, is even the level of liberalization, the level of pressure for development is very, very high in most countries. And simultaneously, you have a process where the more democratic governments also becoming more autocratic. So that is reducing the space for indigenous people and their mobilizations. Now, the way I would think about this recognition of indigenous people rights is that, at least having recognition of territorial rights, it gives you some amount of space, a little bit of space, and where indigenous people have the capacity to practice their own way of economies and own way of doing things. It's very difficult at this point in time, and I agree that within the context of the relationships, economic relations that exist, for them to escape the relationships of production and capitalism that are happening in this. And part of the reason that rights recognition is not taking place in Asia is because of liberalization. It's because government wants to retain those lands so that it can be handed over or it can be used for extractive or productive purposes. So and a lot of this has been a cause of conflict. And I think the only important thing is that having some recognition at least provide some amount of protection and some amount of legal protection against what literally has been, the experiences of people in Asia has been that it has been open loot, it has been open repression and exclusion and disposition of indigenous people. Means if you look at, for example, India, the indigenous people form only 10% of, less than 8% of India's population. But if you look at the number of millions of people who have been displaced, they form 2/3 of the people who have been displaced by development projects since India became independent. That's part of it is because they have no legal protection for their territorial rights. So there's some possibilities which open up when territorial rights are recognized. It's not going to provide the answer, the larger answer to the economic systems and the political systems that are there, but it provides a starting point for the counter movements and counter mobilization. Thanks.
Okay, so Matthew, we're going to try to invite you again. Please ask your question, and if you want, you can introduce yourself. You should be able to start.
Hello.
Yes.
Hello.
Yes, we can hear you.
I want to say something. I am from Assam. I myself, Matiur Rahman, working president of Assam Sannmilita Mahasangha, is a 100 indigenous peoples organization of Assam. We are facing a lot of problems as because UNRIP, in favor of the UNRIP, Indian government also voted in favor of the UNRIP with 133 countries of the world. But till today, it is not implemented. We are approached the Supreme Court of India by a PIL 562/2012. Now our PIL is pending in the 5-member constitution bench. This is the situation. We are trying a lot and we approach the government. Discussion also going on with the Home Minister and other Law Minister and the Secretary itself, but they have not implemented. So we are in the court. This is the first. And second, it is horrible in Assam, 47 and including 17 tribal belts and 30 tribal blocks. And now it is for the protection of the indigenous tribal people, especially. But it is horrible that in this year, by February, government decided to sell the tribal belt and blocks land to non-tribal people. So we request the government, don't do this, because according to the UNRIP, informed and prior consent, they cannot do this, but it is going on. The government is silent. We are approaching, but the government is silent, do not do anything. So in this regard, how can you help us? How can you advise us? How can we proceed for the protection of the indigenous people? Our lands are occupied by the outsiders and the foreigners also. It is also our great problem. From the Bangladesh and Nepal, different peoples are coming and occupied our tribal land and the grazing lands and the hills, and the political parties also support them, back them for vote bank. It is a horrible condition of the indigenous people in Northeast, especially in Assam. So please help us, please guide us. How can we save ourselves in our 1,000 years motherland? All the indigenous peoples are the rulers of Assam up to 1826. 1826, the British occupied the territory of Assam. So a long history. So just I told you, I request you, please help us in this regard, and how can we save ourselves? Thanking you.
So I think the example that you have provided illustrates the things that I've been talking about in context of India and the other countries. And really that, as somebody whose home was original home is India and who's worked with indigenous people in India, this is a situation that you're facing in Assam is really similar to a situation that indigenous people are facing in other parts of the country. And with the current government, the current political system, it's become so difficult to ensure that justice is done. That is sometimes one feels really sense of hopelessness on how to move forward, and especially in context of India, which is really difficult. I think going to the Supreme Court is a good step. One of the things that sometimes you get hearing in the courts of justice, and even with this the alienation of indigenous land, I would say is that the possibility of looking at intervention in the legal system, through the legal system, to challenge it would be. That's the only thing I can suggest at this point of time. Is I feel as helpless as you are when this is happening, because the similar situation, similar problems are happening in other parts across India. This government is essentially now, there is no rule of law, and there is no rule of law, especially for marginalized people.
Thank you, Kundan.
Yeah. Sorry, now just 1 second. I just wanted to say to everybody in the chat that if there is time, we're going to try to ask the questions that are remaining quickly at the end. But if not, we hope to find you again in the next iteration, and either we can still send a third question to Professor Kumar, and if he wants, he can answer to you on an individual basis. Please start.
Thank you. Well, hello, Professor Kumar and Luisa. My name is Laura Mendoza. I'm a PhD candidate here at McGill and a human rights officer for Pluralism based in New York. And what I want to say, perhaps it's a comment and also a question, is how we can read environment and indigenous people's rights from an international criminal law perspective. And we're currently in Colombia and Latin America, we're currently raising the argument that Indigenous peoples and Afro-descendants have been persecuted by the state and different armed actors through environmental crimes. So my question is basically, and for you also, if this has been discussed in different international scenarios, and if perhaps you think, Professor Kumar, that the crime of persecution through environmental damages can be a way to start talking about the Indigenous peoples' recognitions in Asia, for example. So it can be a way to evidence the structural racism in the region and the historical discrimination that Indigenous people in Asia have been subjected to. Thank you.
Thanks, Claudia. This is something which I was not aware of, but I think there's possibility of doing this in Asia. It's obviously the environmental crimes going on and within the environmental laws. At national level, there have been efforts to use the legal system of the to protect Indigenous people, and which have sometimes worked and sometimes not worked. But a global effort at really looking at climate and environmental crimes and linking it to Indigenous people's rights and the repression that the crimes that states are committing against them, that would be something I think I would love to follow this up with you and see how this can move forward in context of Asia. Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe we can address the last question. Neil Bacchus, I might mispronounce your name, but please, if you address, you're invited to speak. Just keep your question as brief as possible.
Thank you so much. Quickly, one of the things in terms of promoting the rights of Indigenous people is regards to accessibility to information. It's lacking sometimes based on the locality and the area they're located. Information is lacking. What in terms of Asia, how is that good? Because in the Caribbean here, from Guyana, we have challenges based upon their location and getting information out, and that would assist in training and development. In Asia, in terms of getting information out, is that how it works there? Thank you.
That's an excellent question. I think the information flow is good where people are organized, where Indigenous people are organized. And what we have seen is that countries, for example, in Indonesia or even in India or Nepal, where grassroots level organization, grassroots level mobilization is there, the information comes out both through social media and through email communications, and kind of gets across to different levels, including international levels. And there have been efforts both in some of these countries to really put together databases and numbers, and like for example, for monitoring conflicts which involve Indigenous people or monitoring cases of criminalization. And so there are existing efforts going on, some of them being supported by different organizations. And so that kind of helps creating a platform. The other part of it is, I think, which is really important, is to kind of get visibility in the national and the regional media, and basically building allies of Indigenous people within the media and within and journalists. And that is something which you can see that again is a pretty strong movement and relationship that Indigenous people have built up with the media and try to get the voices out. However, there are countries where it's extremely difficult to do this, where even if you use social media for saying something which is critical of the government, you're immediately under the threat of being arrested. So for example, in Laos, or for example, in China, and even now increasingly in India, that anything which is seen as being critical of government is being cracked down upon. So that's something which, when we're talking about information and getting out the information, there are two aspects to it: the capacity to get out information, but also whether you are allowed to get out those information, whether the legal space and the political space exists, or if you're penalized for sharing information. I think so. We have both situations in Asian region. Is that there are well-organized networks of information which allows cases of criminalization, etc., to get out. Also building discourses which are kind of pro-Indigenous people. So that also has been happening through the efforts of Indigenous people themselves and their allies. But there are countries where none of these things can be done. And the only information you get out is through covert means about what is happening inside the country, whether it is criminalization, whether it is repression, or whether it is loss of territories. Is difficult to speak about it openly. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much. I wanted to thank you for that. We're running out of time. Unfortunately, we didn't have enough time to go through the questions in the chat. Thank you, Kundan. It was incredible to have you. Thank you for giving all this contextualization of the region of Asia regarding Indigenous people. We are very grateful for having you connecting online from Toronto. And thank you all the people who came to the room, and thank you to the people who connected online from different countries. I hope to see you in the next dialogue. We're going to host one on November 23rd. I invited the UN Special Rapporteur on the rights of safe drinking water and sanitation. He's going to present the report that he just presented to UN Human Rights Council on Indigenous peoples and the situation of safe drinking water. So thank you so much, and I hope to see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming. I hope it was not that tricky to have it.
No, I was just freezing.
We are cold now.
Next to us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everybody, for listening to.
Yeah, may God of host bless you, Kundan Kumar. May God of host bless you.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody. We are gonna end the chat and the call to avoid having too many people speaking at the same time and annoying with our noises of getting out of the room. But thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Kumar. Thank you, Luisa. Thank you.
Okay, take care. I'm logging off. Take care. Bye bye.
Yeah,
Thank
yeah.
you so much, everybody.
Yeah,
Bye.
may God bless you.